Dan Kovalik. Thank you so much for being here with us. He graduated from Columbia University School of Law and is an American human rights lawyer, a labor rights lawyer, and a peace activist who is currently teaching at the University of Pittsburgh. He is also a critic of the United States foreign policy and has stated that every president of the United States that followed World War II was a war criminal. He has authored numerous books on the topic, including The Plot to Attack Iran, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, The Plot to Control the World, and The Plot to Scapegoat Russia. The book we'll be discussing today is No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interests, which has been described as cutting through the Orwellian lies and dissembling those which make so-called humanitarian intervention possible. Just a few words on the book from me before I hand it over to you. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I actually couldn't put it down. There was so much in there. I think that some of my students are participating today, and I really, really want them to read it. I think from a Pakistani perspective, especially from the perspective of the Global South, there was so much in there which is just aligned so much with how we view the US and its foreign policy. So I really, really can't recommend it highly enough. But over to you to discuss it.
Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words. I mean, makes me so happy that you like the book, and I'm very honored to be here today to talk to you all. I think the book is written from the point of view of the Global South, which, you know, as I became an adult, I realized my country was really exploiting, right? And so we have to start with the premise that the U.S. is an imperialist country. It's an empire. And but unlike other empires in the world that have ever existed, it's the only empire that won't admit it's an empire, right? And that's why humanitarian interventionism, so-called, is so important, because the U.S. generally can't intervene in other countries without claiming that they're doing it for some higher purpose, right? In the day, a country like, you know, Britain certainly would intervene and take over other countries like India, and exploit their labor and their resources, and they would claim it was there was some sort of higher purpose, of course. But generally speaking, they were pretty honest about the fact that, you know, they were taking over and it was going to be for their benefit, right? But now, again, in this neo-colonial period, every intervention, every war has to be dressed up in some sort of humanitarian purpose, at least, I would say, when the Democrats in the US are in power. So I think you're going to see more of that now that Biden was elected. Let me just say a little bit about Donald Trump, because I think he's unique in US history, well, for many ways. But one thing about Trump, even though he's known in the US to be a liar, to lie about many things, he could be incredibly candid at times about, for example, the true purposes of US intervention. So we saw, for example, in Syria, he openly said that the US was going to stay there to take the oil. Now, this is shocking, right, to not only Americans, but to the world. In fact, President Assad said that Trump was the greatest president ever for being honest about that. He said similar things about Venezuela, again, wanting their oil. And so Trump has been unique in that way, that he has, in some ways, removed the false veneer of US imperialism, right? It's very interesting. For example, there was the Intercept. I don't know if you know about that publication, but they had a recent report on a leaked memo that showed that the CIA thought Obama was the greatest thing ever for US interventionism, because he put a kind face on US foreign policy, even though his foreign policy was as retrograde as any other president. And I discuss in the book Libya, for example, which has to be discussed. I mean, it really was an overt humanitarian intervention, right? It was pushed by people who've made a career at developing the humanitarian interventionist doctrine. Samantha Power, for example, Susan Rice, and Hillary Clinton. They were the intellectual authors of the intervention in Libya. So this was maybe the most pure humanitarian intervention that we've ever seen, sort of in laboratory conditions, if I could say that. But of course, as it turned out, the results were not humanitarian, the tactics were not humanitarian, and the justification in real life was not humanitarian. If I could just discuss that a little bit, because I think it's very important. So first of all, lies were told to justify the intervention. You know, that Gaddafi was passing out Viagra to his troops so they would engage in mass rapes. I mean, first of all, that's just, you know, on its face doesn't seem plausible. And it wasn't. You know, this was later debunked. The claim even that Gaddafi was going to engage in a genocide in Benghazi, there was no evidence for that. And in fact, Libya had offered for UN observers to verify that this was not happening. And the bombing started before those observers who were on the ground could even do their work. And then finally, there was the worst lie. And I think this is really, again, if we look at a pure humanitarian interventionism and we look at this lie, we see the falsehood behind this whole doctrine. So there was a claim in order to internationalize the conflict. So, you know, in order to get Security Council authorization for this NATO action in Libya, which they did have a limited authorization, they wanted to internationalize the conflict because the whole UN Charter revolves around maintaining international peace and security. So they claimed that Gaddafi was bringing in black mercenaries to Libya to carry out his attacks on his people. This was a complete lie. In fact, again, Amnesty International, while at first parroting that lie, would later, but too late, say this was not true. In fact, that the black people they were talking about were, you know, guest workers that Gaddafi had invited to work there. And also just, you know, black people from sub-Saharan Africa who had lived there for decades, if not longer. And so what this did is a couple things. First, it helped pave the way for this invasion of Libya. But even worse, what it did is it justified in the minds of the jihadists that the US and NATO were working with in Libya to attack the black population as they began to take over Libya and afterwards. And they did that. They depopulated whole towns. They arrested black people en masse. They killed people with darker skin. So the irony of ironies is that this humanitarian intervention, which was done to prevent a genocide, right? We were told, which was pushed by people like Samantha Power, who won a Pulitzer Prize for writing a book, A Problem from Hell, decrying genocide. This intervention actually created a genocide against black people living in Libya. And so we see that the humanitarian intervention was its opposite in this case. And again, I think this is instructive because you have Barack Obama, this beloved president worldwide who won a Nobel Peace Prize, right? Before his even first year in office. Incredibly. I mean, there was he didn't warrant it in any way, but he was so loved that they just, gave him awards for nothing, and it was pushed by these humanitarian interventionists. And we see what the truth is behind this. And if you look at my book and other sources, you'll see these emails between Sidney Blumenthal, who was Hillary Clinton's chief advisor on this, in which he's saying in real time to Hillary Clinton, there were no true humanitarian issues to justify the intervention, but he was pushing for it anyway because he thought this would help Obama with re-election in 2012. So this was just a cynical ploy. I mean, there's more cynicism involved. Every country involved had their own cynical reasons for this. Again, classic old-timey colonial reasons. Italy had just signed an agreement with Gaddafi to make reparations to Libya for Italy's colonial crimes there. So Italy wanted out of that. So they wanted to topple Gaddafi so they could just tear up that agreement, which they have. Sarkozy in France was interested in a couple things. One, Gaddafi's gold reserves that they had just discovered existed, but also because Sarkozy had received $50 million in campaign contributions from Gaddafi, which is illegal under French law to take that kind of money from a foreign source. So he literally wanted to kill Gaddafi because he was a witness to this. By the way, this is not even, this is not a rumor or anything. Sarkozy has subsequently and recently been indicted in France for taking money from Gaddafi. So this was a real thing. So you really had, in his case, in Sarkozy's case, a mafia type hit that he wanted to put on Gaddafi. So this was anything but humanitarian. And yet, certainly, I can't speak for the media in Pakistan, but in the US, it is still regarded in pretty much all the media as a humanitarian endeavor that got rid of a dictator. This was a great thing, even though once in a while you see a story that now slaves are being sold on the streets of Tripoli, but they don't connect that to the intervention, right? Just kind of miraculously this started happening. And so from that point of view, it worked in the sense that the American people were fooled, and probably more or less forever, about what really happened there. And the news basically, again, there's a few stories about Libya once in a while, but basically once Gaddafi was killed, you didn't hear much about Libya again, and how disastrous the situation is there. And again, so in the minds of Americans who have, by the way, probably the worst sense of history of any people on earth to begin with, right? They don't remember even what happened yesterday. They will always believe that this was a great thing that happened. Even very progressive news outlets like Democracy Now! In the US, I don't expect you to know what that is, but it's this independent radio program out of New York City, almost kind of left-wing. And I say that because there's not many left-wing news sources in the US. You have some liberal ones, but left-wing barely exists. They were promoting that war. They cheerled that war in Libya, again, because they bought the humanitarian intervention Kool-Aid. And I fear that with Biden coming back, we're going to see some more of these, right? And again, Trump is a unique figure. And I think it's worth discussing the differences here between the Trumps of the world, the Republicans and the Democrats. They both have the same goals. Let's be clear. Again, the US is an imperial power, period. And it doesn't matter who's leading the government at any given time. They're going to engage in imperial adventures. The justifications just change, really, is what it amounts to. But the interesting thing about Trump, and again, I'm not a Trump supporter at all, and I voted against him, just to be clear. But the unique thing about Trump, and really why the ruling class hated Trump more than any other reason, was that he did talk about ending the US's endless wars abroad.
Yeah.
Now, he didn't do much to advance that. I guess he was trying to get out of Afghanistan. There was a lot of pushback, mostly from liberals, by the way. And we can talk about that. And I do want to talk about that. But for the most part, he really didn't disengage much. He talked about getting out of Syria, made a move to get out of Syria, didn't get out of Syria. Again, saying, let's just stay to get the oil. But the one thing he did do or didn't do is start a new war. That's the one thing he didn't do, unlike Obama, unlike almost every one of his predecessors. Now, it seemed like, that wasn't for want of trying, because, with Iran, he did plenty of provocative things, like the murder of General Soleimani, for example, threatened to bomb Iran at one point. It seemed like he wanted a war there, at least at one point, though he seemed maybe ambivalent about that. So that's kind of what sets him apart. The other thing that sets him apart is that again, unlike Obama, who the CIA loved, Trump was not a good face of U.S. imperialism. He is crass. He is coarse. He looks like a clown. He acts like a clown. He's not what we think of as presidential. And this was bad for the U.S. empire, because the world couldn't buy that the U.S. under Trump was doing anything good for anyone for any good reason, right? And again, that's really why the ruling class couldn't stand him more than anything. They would, again, dress up their own opposition in more lofty language. But that was the big reason. And again, as I think I mentioned in the book, the interesting part about Trump and the reaction to him was that the only time he was considered presidential, and they literally use that term, was when he bombed Syria. And that literally there were, mainstream, news was saying, finally, he's looking presidential. He bombed another country. This is true. I'm not making this up. This is an incredible fact that's how you look presidential. You bomb someone. It's like, I don't know, do you ever watch gangster movies? I love mafia movies, The Godfather, Goodfellas. They talk about making your bones, right? Making your bones means you kill someone. And that's how a president makes his bones. He bombs someone. And so going back to humanitarian interventionism, it's a fig leaf to justify, these killing sprees. Obviously, the U.S. is the most dangerous country on earth, the most violent, the most lawless. You may or may not know that the U.S. has sanctioned the International Criminal Court because it wants to investigate the U.S. for its war crimes in Afghanistan. The U.S. has absolutely no regard for international law. It kind of made a pretense to early on, but now it has even given up on pretending to do it. And again, this is something that most Americans don't understand. And that's the other interesting thing about humanitarian interventionism. It is designed to fool Americans first and foremost, right? To gain their consent for these insane wars that are bleeding this country dry, right? We're spending $1 trillion a year on the military, while we have the worst numbers in the world in terms of the pandemic, right? The most cases of COVID, the most deaths. People are hungry. We have tent cities. Homelessness is huge. Again, I don't know if that's the perception abroad that's happening, but it is. But meanwhile, we have unlimited resources to carry out these wars. So to justify it in the minds of Americans, who at least, by and large are not bad people, they have to be convinced it's for some, lofty purpose. But of course, the rest of the world, for the most part, isn't fooled, right? And that's the interesting thing about the humanitarian interventionism and all the lies that are told to justify these wars. The only people really believe them are Americans, right? People abroad see us for what we are, for the most part. And I always felt that the first time I went abroad to Nicaragua, the thing that struck me and still strikes me is the most uneducated peasant in a place like Nicaragua has a greater sense of history and world politics than the most educated American. In part because we're miseducated, right? All these people who run our country, who go to Harvard, you know, and they pretty much all do go to Harvard or Yale, whatever. It's not that they're uneducated, but they're miseducated about the nature of the United States, about the nature of the world, about the nature of U.S. imperialism, and they believe their own bullshit. I'm sorry to use that term, but they believe these illusions, right? Someone like Samantha Power, who, you know, advocated for this war in Libya, I'm certain she believed somehow that it was being done for a righteous person. And in fact, she put out this new memoir about a year ago.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that in the book, and I think it's very telling. She only gives 5 pages to the Libya escapade, even though that was maybe the most important thing she ever did in her life. It'll probably be the most important thing she ever did, is she helped lead a war which destroyed a country, right? But in a book of like 300 some pages about her life, Libya gets 5 pages. And she more or less sloughs off what happened in Libya as kind of like, well, we meant well, but oops, and moves on, right? In most likely because she can't deal with it, that she can't come to grips with what she did. Those are the imperial illusions. Again, we tell ourselves. We tell the world these things too. And again, I think Hollywood does a good job of, you know, promoting the U.S. imperial policy abroad. You know, you look at movies like Wonder Woman, for example, which are seen as these great feminist movies, and they're really just promoting the military industrial complex. Same thing with Black Panther. The only good white character was a CIA agent, right? I mean, that's not by accident. You know, we try to sell this stuff to the world, and again, some people buy it. But for the most part, it's Americans that are consuming these lies and the humanitarian interventionist doctrine. And one of my big goals in life is to try to undermine that, to undermine those illusions. And that's why I wrote this book. And I hope it has some impact. Again, it's going to be more relevant now with Biden as president than with Trump, because he didn't bother claiming that anything he did was for humanitarian purposes. He just said, we want oil and we're going to go steal it. Biden will say, you know, in terms of the next war, that he's doing it to spread democracy and all that. And it's going to be a lie. And people need to be immunized against that, you know, and what I wrote about, I hope, does that to some limited extent anyway. So I didn't check my time here. Oh, okay. I'm right on time. Okay. Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think those are like probably my 2 favorite parts of the book. Firstly, the takedown of all of these human rights people, especially you did a really, really good takedown of Kenneth Roth, head of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, for promoting these neoliberal human rights, which kind of prop up this imperialist motives all the time, and their hypocrisy is alarming. Like when you actually sit down and read the comments that you'd put in the book, it actually surprised me. And again, the whole feminism angle, that why are we in Afghanistan, or we're there to protect women, but actually women are not doing any better. So what are we actually there for, and why do we keep on, you know, women washing all of these crimes and attempting to say that they're for human rights? I can see that there are a few questions coming in, so I'm going to try and cut it down so that people can also ask their questions. But I wanted to firstly, you cite the fact that America isn't on the wrong side, it is the wrong side. So will it forever be driven by the appetites of an empire? We've talked a lot about imperialism, or is there some kind of paradigm shift which is possible, where such a military or overdeveloped power can be a force for good? I know that we won't see it with the Biden administration, but is there any other kind of way that you can see that paradigm shift occurring?
I mean, there's always hope, right? There's 2 things that I think are going to happen at some point. I mean, What I'd like to see happen is that the American people finally say, no, we don't want to be an empire. But I mean, it's like an alcoholic, right? I mean, the first thing you have to do is admit you have a problem. I mean, we have to admit we're an empire to then say we don't want to be an empire. Yeah. And again, we haven't even admitted that to ourselves by and large. But again, a robust peace movement in the U.S. that called a halt to this, military industrial complex and to these wars, maybe could change this country. That would be my hope, my dream, right? But I think even if that doesn't happen, what we do see, not that nothing's inevitable in the world, but I do see, and you're kind of seeing it now, you've been watching the news, the empire's going to fall regardless. The U.S. is a fading economic power. It is guaranteeing that, by the way. It's now sanctioning 39 different countries, right? And all these countries are going to find ways to get around the U.S. dollar to create, kind of an alternative economy. And the U.S. is going to sanction itself out of the world economy, quite ironically. But also there are just severe problems in the United States, again, that have been exposed in the last year, with the total mishandling of the pandemic, worse than any country on earth, right? And in the process, the crippling of the economy. I just think at some point we're not going to be able to be this great military power that we are now. But the thing is, like a wounded animal, in the meantime, the U.S. may lash out as it falls, and that's that makes it a scary time. But eventually it just won't be able to do that. And again, who knows, maybe the problems within the U.S., the civil unrest is going to be so great, and the differences between states, that maybe it'll collapse as a nation, that it'll become the balkanized country that we've tried to make other countries, right?
Wow.
Yeah. So I think the empire will fall one way or another. But my guess is it will fall the ugly way by just, under the weight of its own corruption, frankly.
Okay, interesting. I think that my next question kind of follows on from that. So former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, great guy that he is, once said, weakness is provocative. And there's a really real anxiety in Western capitals and Western capitalism that abdicating the role of global policemen will only create the field for even more belligerent actors. So say a rising China or a resurgent Russia. So if that is the case, would it even make sense for the U.S. to withdraw from its role to stand by?
Well, of course, I don't believe Rumsfeld's correct. I mean, the way I view history, particularly with, for example, first of all, I don't see China and Russia as any kind of a threat. Okay. I mean, China, whatever, China isn't perfect, but, their form of, if you want to call it imperialism, is building roads and hospitals, and right. They don't bomb their way to domination. And Russia, really much beyond its borders, doesn't show to me much inclination to be an imperial power. They just want a buffer so they can be left alone, right? But if we look, for example, at terrorism, right, and the U.S. has created every terrorist group that it's fighting, right? I mean, the irony is it's intervention that's gotten into a lot of the problems we're already in, right? Supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s, which morphed into Al-Qaeda, supporting the jihadists in Libya, then went to Syria, and supporting jihadists in Syria. I mean, the truth is the U.S. is the font of those problems to begin with. And so it seems to me if the U.S. retreats from the world, it's not only good for the world, it's good for us. I mean, we have created the enemies, the monsters that we fight. And that's where Rumsfeld, I think, is wrong. And yeah, as far as China and Russia, they would be happy to work with the U.S. They've made many overtures in that regard. They don't view, they don't view a strong United States as a threat to them per se. I mean, some of the actions the U.S. does, but they don't view the fact that the U.S. is preeminent as a problem. Whereas the U.S. views China and Russia as strong states as a problem in and of itself. Do you see? That's what Rumsfeld's talking about. The U.S. wants to be a unipolar superpower. Russia and China, that's not their goal. But if you want to be a unipolar superpower, it means no one else can be a superpower. And that's what the U.S., that's their issue with Russia and China. And that's not a legitimate issue as far as I'm concerned. I want to see a multipolar world in which countries like China and Russia are become a check on U.S. power. I mean, that's what has to happen. The U.S. has to be reined in.
Okay. So my third question is, you spend a lot of the book talking about self-determination. And I think now what we're seeing more of, especially from the global south, from countries in Africa and Asia, the kind of shift in the discourse about self-determination, where after decades and decades of the Washington Consensus, we are now asking, how do developing economies break away from the stranglehold of global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, in a way that we can make it not a focus of self-determination, a political issue, but also an economic one. What do you think about that? What do you think about the likelihood of that?
Well, I do think it's very possible. Obviously, I think as an initial, in the initial phase, and this may not be so welcome to people, and I understand, but I mean, as an initial thing, I think it might mean at least temporarily aligning with countries like Russia and China and Iran, stronger powers to create this alternative economic grouping. But again, I understand a country like Pakistan, in many other global South countries, they don't want to be beholden to anybody. And I understand that, and there's this huge non-aligned movement that I very much support. But I think, truthfully, and I don't know how people feel about Iran, but the one thing I'll say about Iran, for example, is that they have learned to be almost entirely independent economically because they've been forced to by U.S. sanctions. And now they make they generate a lot more revenue from non-oil industries than from oil because they've had to do this. So they definitely point to a way that countries can do that. And part of it is also growing your own food. Food sovereignty is going to be very important. We don't import food. You make your own. You become much more self-sufficient. I think another country that maybe is even a better example is Cuba, because they're a much smaller country than Iran, and they don't have as many resources as Iran. And yet they have proven that they can do a lot, not only for their own people, but for other countries in the way of medical solidarity, for example, with very little. And truthfully, I think that points the way to the future, not only for the global South, but even the global North. I mean, I think with problems with climate change and whatnot, we're going to have to learn to do more with less. And I think Cuba has shown that can be done if you're organized on a socialist basis. And I do think that points to the future. So it is possible.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with you. I was actually really surprised to see that Iran's GDP was much higher than Pakistan's. And it does point in the direction of what you're saying, that self-sufficiency is better, regardless of how much we've heard about the benefits of fair trade or free trade. And especially at a time like this with coronavirus, it kind of just encapsulates that, exacerbates that need for self-sufficiency even more. I kind of want to turn now to the human rights question. I wanted to ask you, how do you combat this intellectual poverty around human rights and break out of this neoliberal straitjacket? And I think there's now so much more scholarship about where the discourse has gone wrong with human rights, how it's totally subsumed any kind of like class justice or social justice movements, and the fact that the language of human rights itself has narrowed itself down to only civil and political, and it did so because they were trying to be very anti-communist and anti the USSR. So how, from the lens of Western liberalism, do we try and promote economic rights and social development and not let it be straitjacketed like this, human rights?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. It's the big question, right? I think what we have to do is first of all, I mean, we have to dissect every one of these interventions, first of all, and show that they're not humanitarian. And again, I think Libya is a great teaching tool for that. Sadly, I mean, I'm sorry for the Libyans that they have to be a teaching tool, but the truth is it happened and we have to learn from it. And I think we need to go through Libya and Yugoslavia, in all these interventions and dissect them to show, okay, they're not humanitarian. And given that those weren't humanitarian, it's likely that the next intervention won't be. So that's a big thing. And we need to challenge these human rights groups. I just think, go toe to toe with them and point out their hypocrisy and their double standards at every turn. I think it might be, and people have tried, to create alternative human rights groups, that have a more global South-centered view. I think that would be worth it. But in terms of the economic rights you're talking about, I think that's an easy push because, again, even in the U.S., which, the U.S. has dominated the world's resources since World War II. After World War II, the U.S. controlled 50% of the world's resources. I mean, that's incredible, right? But even now, we dominate 25% of its resources, right? And that's why we intervene. That's really the truth about it, and that needs to be exposed. But even with that, we now have a country that has massive amount of poverty, massive amount of hunger, disease, homelessness. People here are now, I think, receptive to the idea that economic rights have to be defended and advanced. Again, already in the global South, they know that, they see that, they live with this, economic deprivation. So they see that. But I think in the U.S., they're going to see it too. So I actually think it's a very good time to try to push these economic rights.
And yet you elect Bernie Sanders, who's actually running on that platform, which, I think in terms of a developed rich country, when anyone looks at the US and looks at the amount of poverty, and I think it's the same in the UK now as well, it's shocking that the healthcare there is so poor. It's shocking that there are no social welfare systems in place that can adequately provide for the entire population and the levels of inequality. I'm going to ask a question now, which I think plays into a lot of, I can see that we're already getting questions in and we'll turn to them, but you've made a very comprehensive case against humanitarian intervention, but is there no instance, I know that you do talk about Kosovo and you do talk about Rwanda in the book and how much the West has also contributed to making those crises, but is there no instance in which a certain limited form of intervention can be justified to achieve a very, very specific narrow purpose? And I'm talking also about the Syrian Assad regime, because even those people who are not really in the thrall of interventionist forces, they admit that the Assad regime is very barbaric and brutal. So you say that to do no harm means doing nothing, but what about when doing nothing will lead to great harm?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that I certainly see the possibility at times for, as you say, some sort of limited humanitarian intervention. I'd like to see something done for the Palestinians, for example. I'd like to see peacekeepers maybe in the occupied territories to protect the Palestinians from, these horrible Israeli assaults. I would be open to something like that. I think there are cases that you could justify, but I would say that I would be forever reluctant to allow the Western powers to be a part of that in any significant way. That is to say, if you're going to do a humanitarian intervention, and I think I talk in the book about the fact that, and we know this if we know anything about international law, the UN Charter provides that it would be up to the Security Council to make those decisions. And so any humanitarian intervention I would like to see done through the UN and the Security Council and through UN forces, though we've seen those forces be brutal in their own way, right? In Haiti and Central Africa. I mean, just because they wear blue helmets doesn't make them necessarily any better. But I would be open to that. I don't want to say you would never do that. And I do give some cases. I mean, to me, the greatest humanitarian intervention was the Cuban intervention in Southern Africa, which helped overthrow apartheid. Though they wouldn't have called it a humanitarian intervention. They saw it as, you know, international solidarity, anti-imperialism. And I think any intervention that I would support would be in the context of anti-imperialism, not to advance imperialism. And I think, look, the UN has to be restructured. If I could just kind of, you know, the Security Council has to be changed. You can't have the same few powers have veto power over the world. You know, that has to change. We already have rotating members of the Security Council, but they don't have veto power. We have to open up the veto power to a rotation. You know, it's all based on who won World War II, with the exception of France, because they were mostly on the side of the Nazis for most of the war. It doesn't make sense anymore, you know, so that has to be restructured so that you could actually have what appears to be more of a true humanitarian intervention. Right now, again, it's really impossible to do through the Security Council, given that, you know, the big powers will just cancel each other out, you know?
Yeah, entirely. I completely agree. And I think I've rarely had an essay written for me by a student which hasn't ended with, give the General Assembly all of the powers that you give to the Security Council, because it just seems like the veto power is so outdated. You're talking 50 years on, and it's remarkable that it continues to exist. I will now go through, sorry, did you want to make a comment?
No, I agree with you. In the General Assembly, they tend to vote the right way on everything, right? And the US and Israel, and then a few Micronesian countries that are blackmailed might vote the other way, but generally the General Assembly shows wisdom on practically every issue. So I would support that, right, to put all the power in the General Assembly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you can also see the Q&A, but I will read out.
Yeah, could you do that? That's great. Yeah, because I could pop it up, but then I'm going to be distracted. So yeah, if you ask me, that'd be great.
So we have one question saying Trump has ignited white terrorism. Is that just the beginning for the US? What do you think?
I mean, it's a great question. I think that has always been a part of the United States, obviously. I agree that Trump has encouraged it and kind of brought it out into the open in a way that it hasn't been in many years. I think that, yes, it will continue on some level. The truth is, I believe, and again, maybe I probably sound naive in this way, but I believe if the government were to start taking care of human needs in this country, that would dissipate. You know, I think a lot of that is a reaction to people seeing their country falling apart, looking for answers in all the wrong places, blaming all the wrong people. You know, people tend to blame downwards for their problems, right? They don't blame upwards, you know. Mm-hmm. The problem in our country comes from the Jeff Bezoses of the world, mm-hmm. and the Elon Musks, right? The people who have taken everything for themselves, but they don't get the blame. People blame poor people or whatever. I think if we dealt with some of those economic inequalities and we dealt with these deprivations, I do think that would be the temperature would be lowered, and those groups would have a lot less support than they do now. And I hope that there will be some move towards that.
Yeah, I agree, and I share your hope. So I have another question here from Abbas Anwar. I wanted to ask that with states committing serious international crimes against their own citizens within their borders, what alternatives does the international community have to humanitarian intervention? Sanctions have their own problems.
Yeah, I mean, that again, it's a great question. I think I would like to see a more vigorous international system where you could actually, have enforcement mechanisms through something like the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, to have more targeted measures against states that are committing those acts. But even as you ask the question, the problem that I see with humanitarian interventionism to begin with is, what states do you start intervening in, right? I mean, again, right now, I saw a funny, maybe you've seen it too, a funny meme, and it's of Assad, President Assad, saying Syria will no longer stand by. It will start supporting the moderate rebels in the United States, right? I mean, we could begin in the US, right? But that's never going to happen. I mean, the problem with humanitarian interventionism, of course, is it's always going to run north to south because we have all the military might, right? It's never going to run south to north.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, and by the way, the UN Charter requires us, is that we have to use more diplomatic measures to deal with those issues. And again, kind of building on what I said about dealing with the problems in the US, I would say also is the first way to deal with the problems abroad, and that is help countries with real development. Help countries get the medicines they need and the food they need and the water they need. And again, I think if you had that type of international cooperation, that would be the beginning of helping countries with their, political problems. I mean, these economic rights, as you mentioned, have been totally ignored.
Yeah.
All we focus on are these civil and political rights. And I think it's putting the cart before the horse. I think we have to start getting people's needs taken care of. And I think once you start doing that, again, I think the political unrest and these other things will, I'm not saying it would take care of all those things, but it would help a lot. We have to begin, with international solidarity. I mean, that's what I call for, not humanitarian interventionism, but solidarity. And if you start from that premise, I think a lot of these issues will at least be, improved. Yeah, that's my thought. Again, maybe I sound Pollyannish, but
no, we're very optimistic here, which is great. So another follow-up question to that. Also, you mentioned that we may see a return to U.S. humanitarian intervention under the Biden administration. Where do you feel such intervention is most likely in the coming years?
Well, I think there's two hot spots. Although, look, I mean, the problem is the U.S. has its sights set on everywhere. There's reasons to think it could be against China. It could be against Russia. I think China is a more likely target. You may know the writer and documentary filmmaker John Pilger, who's of course from the UK.
Yeah.
He wrote that, or he did that movie called The Coming War with China. I mean, I don't think that's out of the question. But I think more likely we're going to still see it in the Middle East, in West Asia. I mean, that's still going to be a hot spot. I mean, as long as the U.S. continues to tail Israel, on its foreign policy goals, which are completely retrograde, the U.S. is going to keep intervening in that region in a very negative way.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my view. Africa, and the U.S. is already intervening there. The news doesn't cover it at all, but the U.S. is becoming very active in Africa militarily. I think you're going to see more of that, particularly because of the resource scramble in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which again gets no press coverage. I don't know, maybe in Pakistan it does, it gets none here. And in South America, I think Venezuela is going to be on the target list. In fact, I saw that Biden invited Juan Guaido's ambassador to the inauguration, which shows that, you know, the U.S. is going to keep up its regime change operations there. And then when I hear myself speaking, I guess I'm saying everywhere. Right? I mean, it's incredible, right?
Yeah.
There's nowhere. I mean, I always say this, you know, that you will listen to the news. And again, these news reporters will say, you know, there are now tensions between the U.S. and China in the South China Sea. It's called the South China Sea for, you know, why are we even there, right? There's tensions between the U.S. and Iran in the Persian Gulf. Iran is Persia. You know, the U.S. lays claim to everything. It's incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah. Another question by Saman Iqbal. In the era of post-truth politics, especially in the context of the United States, how important is ideologically motivated news in legitimizing humanitarian intervention?
I think it's the key to it. I think it's the absolute key to it. In this country, certainly, there is virtually no space to argue against humanitarian interventionism, right? Mm-hmm. If you oppose U.S. intervention in Syria, you're considered an Assadist, right? If you oppose U.S. intervention in Russia, you're a Putin apologist. You're immediately attacked. Mm-hmm. And you see this with Tulsi Gabbard, for example. And again, I guess I don't expect you to know all of our political figures. No. But, you know, she ran for president, and she's a veteran herself, and she was very anti-interventionist, and she was attacked for this, mostly by the liberal media. And I should mention that. I think the liberals in the U.S. are more hawkish than the conservatives. Yeah. That was not always true, but there's been a bit of a flip there. But in any case, yeah, the media has almost no room. Again, interestingly, the only room there is for that is in conservative media outlets. For example, Tucker Carlson on Fox News. He's one of the few mainstream people who will actually have someone on to oppose interventionism, including Tulsi Gabbard out of Hawaii. We do need alternative news sources to start covering these things in a real way. And in fact, I bristle quite a bit when I hear, oh, Trump's a liar and all that. Yeah, he's a liar, but so are you, news media. Like, you lied us into the war in Iraq. That was based on lies that the New York Times, our great New York Times, pushed harder than anybody, right? Everyone's lying, but the lies about the wars are the worst kind of lies, because those kill millions of people, So, yeah, I mean, and again, even Democracy Now!, the one news source alternative, they're pushing humanitarian interventionism now. It is such a powerful doctrine. And we need to ideologically tear it apart. I mean, that's what we have to do. We have to destroy it. I mean, that's my goal in life, is to help destroy it, dismantle it, brick by brick.
Yeah, and it's shocking that the New York Times columnist who really shilled for the war in Iraq and said that would be amazing and something that we should absolutely do, faced no accountability for not seeing. None of these political pundits seem to see anything beyond 2 inches in front of them, and yet there's no accountability for that. They're still talking about how we should go to war in Syria or Iran and earning six figures and discussing their stock portfolios probably, but it's really shocking to see.
Yeah, can I give one other example of this? I mean, that is just amazing. So again, the liberal New Yorker magazine, David Remnick is the editor. He pushed for the Iraq War. He wrote this column that was very influential in February 2003, pushing for the Iraq War. He's still the editor of the magazine. And they kicked Seymour Hersh out of the magazine. He used to write for them.
Mm.
Seymour Hersh, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who has exposed war crimes going back to the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, cannot even get published in the United States anymore. He now writes for a German, what is it, DW? I forget what that stands for. Yeah.
Mm.
That's how crazy it's gotten, that a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist can't even get published in the US because he exposes US war crimes.
Mm. Yeah, it's really shocking. So another question, we tend to treat the US establishment in discourse about American imperial designs as a single entity. As a comparison, when we speak about the Pakistani establishment, we speak of one actor, the military. Who is really calling the shots in the US? Is it the corporations? Throwback to United Fruit? Does the CIA have its own interests? Are there any cracks in the alliance between the state, the bureaucracy, and the corporate interests, or is it a singular hive mind?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah,
I could write a whole book on it. Maybe I will. I would certainly go back to President Eisenhower's terminology, the military industrial complex. You know, you have this this marriage between the military and these private companies that are profiting from war. I think they, and the intelligence establishment that largely agrees with them, I think that they are running U.S. foreign policy more than anyone. Now, are there divisions within this? Yes, of course. Because why? Because certain economic, certain members of the ruling class benefit more with relations with Russia than others, or relations with China than others. So there's always going to be divisions. It's nothing in life when you deal with, if you have 3 people in the room, you're going to have 4 different opinions, right? And that's true even with the ruling class. They're not completely united on this. Although what I will say they are completely united on is that the U.S. has the right to intervene anywhere in the world to protect whatever interests, these people can agree on should be advanced. That there is no division in the ruling class on that. And we see, for example, I don't know if you followed Bolivia a lot, after Morales was ousted there about a year and several months ago. And of course, the human rights groups were all totally complicit in that. Yeah. Human Rights Watch, especially. Terrible. But a lot of people were opining, was this done so the U.S. and people like Elon Musk could get a hold of Bolivia's lithium supplies? And Elon Musk would later say, we will coup anyone we want, in response to those claims that he was involved in the coup in Bolivia, suggesting that, in fact, he was involved somehow. So, again, that doesn't mean everyone cares about lithium in Bolivia. But what it does mean is that the military-industrial complex certainly is being used to advance those types of interests and will continue to be.
I'm going to have to cherry pick the questions now because we're really running out of time. So one of the questions is, Dan wanted to speak more about Afghanistan. Can we elaborate on his views on the situation there?
Yeah, I mean, my view is the U.S. has to get out of Afghanistan. Now, when I say get out, I mean militarily. I just think we need to go. We've been there 20 years now. And that's, with actual boots on the ground. And we've been intervening in Afghanistan now since the 70s. I mean, it's never ended up good for those people. It's always been bad. At the same time, I think we owe them a lot in terms of development aid and that sort of thing. And that the U.S. would have to do, right? I mean, I don't say we should abandon Afghanistan. I would never say that. We owe them a lot. But don't think troops on the ground there should be there anymore. We've proven we can't do anything or don't want to, or actually are undermining things. You know, when the U.S. intervened in Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban, for all of its faults, had opium production down almost zero. Now, after the U.S. invasion, Afghanistan is producing 85% of the world's heroin, which is not only devastating Afghani society, and it is because there's huge problems with addiction there now, but it's devastating other societies around the world, including the U.S. society, which has a huge opiate addiction problem. That's one example where we have just made things worse. And we are clearly cannot make things better. As I point out in the book, one of the big reasons the liberals claim that they want to stay in Afghanistan is to protect women's rights, which, by the way, the CIA seized upon years ago as to justify intervening in Afghanistan. And I don't see the CIA as a feminist organization. I mean, this is just a pretext. But as I point out in the book, according to a UN study, Afghanistan right now is the worst in the world, the bottom ranked in terms of women's rights. And that's after 20 years of U.S. intervention. I mean, so what are we doing? Who are we protecting? I'm not saying that once the U.S. leaves, there aren't going to be huge problems. But our military presence is not solving those problems, and we need to get out. We need to get out of the Middle East entirely and West Asia entirely. I want the U.S. out. I want the U.S. out of everywhere. I mean, really, I want the troops home. I would like to see our troops doing things here, building bridges, building roads, getting people immunized. Let's take care of our own house first. And again, I think the world will be much better off.
Yeah. I always find it very interesting whenever I see research from Afghanistan that they primarily focus on attitudes towards the US by Afghans. But when you look at their tribal affiliations, they're all either Hazara, Tajik. They never ask the actual Pashtuns, which make up the majority of the population and who are incredibly anti-American. Right. So Hamza is asking, what do you have to say about the balance of power between the hegemons of the contemporary era as it was seen during the European imperialism? Is it possible? Is the balance of power possible?
Well, yes, I think there is a balance that is beginning. I mean, I do think China and Russia, for example, are becoming a counterweight, an effective counterweight against U.S. and European imperialism. And that's why the U.S. is so upset at China and Russia. Again, just because they exist more than, as powerful entities. Absolutely. And I welcome it. I absolutely welcome it. I think it's long overdue. I'll just say, I mean, and again, maybe I expose myself too much by saying this, but I still regret the fall of the Soviet Union. I think the Soviet Union played an amazing role in countering U.S. imperialism and in supporting anti-colonial struggles. And I think the U.S. is afraid Russia will, play that role again. And I welcome it. And I think you're seeing that a bit now.
So we have another question from Aruba Mansour. Is it correct to say that the primary motivation for U.S. neocolonialism is oil exploration with greater emphasis on renewable energy? Can we expect such an attitude to change?
Well, yes. I mean, that is an interesting thing. If you look at where the U.S. has been focused in terms of its colonial adventures in recent years, yes, it's been in oil-rich areas. The Middle East, Libya, Venezuela, it's all been about oil. The Iraq War was clearly about oil. But as you're right, as we move away from oil for environmental reasons, and as oil becomes less valuable, which it is becoming less valuable, you recall last year, in fact, it dipped below $0. It was more costly to house than it was to sell. It will just be a matter of going after other resources. And so, yes, you probably will see the U.S. moving away from wars in the Middle East, and then again focusing on places like Congo that have these rare minerals that are needed more for electric cars, computers, cell phones. Though I do think there is one other issue in the Middle East that's going to keep the U.S. there, and that's Israel. I mean, that's something else. That's a totally different thing than resource capturing. And that is Israel's goal to have a greater Israel and to take over bigger parts of the region. And as long as the U.S. again is wedded to that goal, it will be there, you know, and that's a sad fact.
So I know we've gone over time and we have a bunch of other questions as well. So I mean, it's up to you if you want to continue to take one or two more. Whether
let's do two more. Let's do two more.
Sure. So Emil is asking, how can the UN improve its peacekeeping mechanism to intervene where necessary and take measures to resolve the crises that require intervention by use of force?
Yeah, well, I think, again, I think we have to restructure the UN so that there's a different leadership. That would be the first thing. I mean, I just think it's not working now. And then if that happened, let's say the General Assembly was given all the power, then certainly they could recruit and train, troops from around the world to do this type of peacekeeping. Again, I have some reluctance about it because I have seen, you know, again, you look at how brutal the Haitians were treated by the Brazilian troops there. I mean, rapes, murders. Then you had the Nepalese troops who, of course, brought cholera there. I mean, a lot of these interventions, even by the UN, the cure is worse than the disease, right? But with that said, they would have to create a truly international force where those troops were loyal to no one but the United Nations, not to their home countries. I think that's probably possible. But again, I would want different leadership before that happened, because we can't have these troops being basically used as imperial troops, which they have been in the past. Again, particularly in Africa. So.
Okay, final question. Again, on the Afghanistan issue, Safa Imran is asking, do you believe that the shift in the US administration from Trump to Biden will affect or perhaps entirely undermine the efforts of the Afghan peace deal and the withdrawal of troops? Biden alluded to wanting to keep a small percentage of troops on the ground for counterterrorism purposes.
Yes, I'm certain that this will change, that Trump's goal to take us out of Afghanistan will end with Biden. I think Biden will keep us there with more than a small group of troops. I mean, I think the Democrats have been very clear about this, and the mouthpiece of the Democrats in the media are very clear about this, that they want us to stay in Afghanistan. And sadly, I think Biden will keep us there. No question.
Okay, thank you so much for being with us. I'm sorry I ran over time.
It's great. It's great. I just want to say how grateful I am to do this. This was tremendous for me. So I would love to do it again if you would like, but I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you to all of the participants for asking great questions and being here with us.